Regarding the last presentation too on the double stars, I wanted to mention that one of the reasons I like to present a synopsis of the various reports is that I think it helps some of our observers to see these light curves, and to it might help them actually detect a double star in their data when they wouldn't otherwise notice it. So on my screen, that slide is getting cut off on the bottom. I don't know about others. Maybe I can reduce that. Okay. So I'll go ahead with the next presentation. Last year, we presented R OTE, and this year we're going to present an update to R OTE 3.8.2. Next slide. Okay, so yes, in the previous slide I also noted that R OTE is written by Bob Anderson, who has been a contributor to Iota for many years now. He wrote Ocular, and trying to move forward from Ocular to some new techniques. He wrote R OTE. Last year we released R OTE 3.1.1 at the Iota conference. This year we're releasing the update 3. And drop that one decimal point there in the slide, 3.8.2. And I'll update you on the new features that are being provided in 3.8.2. I'm not going to go back over all of the old features that were included in 3.1.1. If you'd like, you can go back and look at the presentation from 2013 conference. And in this slide package, I've inserted the links both to the PDF of the slides, and then there was a recording that was made of the presentation. And so if you wanted to go back and see all the different features, you could go back to the previous conference. Next slide. So some of the major advances in 3.8.2 over last year's version is now you can read line movie and Tangra files directly without any modification, which really speeds up the process. It allows loading a secondary light curve that you can then compare to the target star light curve, and also you can do some normalizing from that light curve if needed. It performs timestamp error checking and validation of event frames. So I'll show that in later slides here, how it does that. And it now reports all solutions in both readings and in date time format. That way, if we're cross-comparing with other people that may only be doing their work in readings, we can compare back and forth, and then it will also produce a report in date time format. Next slide. One of the past problems with Tangra files is that they've had blank entries when Tangra loses tracking, or the PSF function doesn't return a valid data point. And blanks don't work well in light curves, or in light curve processing software. So R OTE now interpolates blank cells to allow complete processing of Tangra files. Another thing that it does is that Tangra produces a CSV file that has the raw data and then a background data, but it doesn't do the subtraction of the background from the raw data that we need to be able to analyze the mag drop. And R OTE will do that automatically. And then finally, it implements a new integer frame or subframe timing algorithm that's based on AIC, Akaike Information Criterion statistical analysis, and I'll highlight that. Next slide. So this is the a highlight of the timestamp and error checking validation. So there's two methods. One is if there is a timestamp in the data, both LineMovie and Tangra will read the VTI timestamps. If those are present, then R OTE will scan the time stamp against the readings and note if there are any variances from a uniform progression of the timestamp, and those are shown as spikes. So that alerts you to where there are discordances in the timestamp, and then you can relate that to your event and see if the timestamps are affecting your event. The panel to the right is another method in that we can read the timestamp, and then R OTE will compare the readings from two different points in the video and see if there's any discordances in those two areas, between those two areas. And at the bottom, you see that it says valid times. There were 508 intervals enclosed. So the easiest way to do that is if there are discordances in the timestamps, we can actually go to a very narrow range right around the disappearance and the reappearance areas and check for discordances within those very narrow time intervals. And if there are no discordances within the event times, then we know we can use the timestamp to analyze those event times. Next frame, next slide. So R OTE is now reporting both in readings and in date time format. So readings are handy sometimes when we don't have timestamps on the video, so we're just working in readings. But if we do have a timestamp, we get the disappearance and reappearance as seconds from the beginning of the video, and then also as a date and time based on the universal time. Then we get durations in readings in seconds as well. Next slide. This is an example of how R OTE will interpolate a Tangra file with blank or missing values. It shows the light curve, and then the interpolated values are shown as red dots. And so that's very helpful, especially if those may be occurring within the occultation event. We want to be aware that there might be blank Tangra values in those areas. Next slide. Okay, so the issue of subframe timing is an important one for us because it allows us to get more precision and accuracy, especially out of our integrated videos. But even on our non-integrated videos, where we have very high signal-to-noise ratio, subframe timing allows us to get even higher precision in our timing results. And I know this has been somewhat controversial with some folks, and I'll try to explain a little bit about how this works. Um, but we could probably, and Bob Anderson intends to write a paper on this subject, but this will suffice so that you can see what's in R OTE. So first, R OTE uses a Kayaki information criteria. It's a statistical process for comparing models, actually comparing two different model analysis of the same data. So if we think there are multiple possible models, say one model is that there is no occultation, that the event is a straight line, or another model might be there is an occultation and it's a square wave. We can compare those two against the data to see which model best fits the data. So what Bob has done is he's now using a Kayaki information criteria to decide if there is a high enough signal to noise ratio that intermediate points in the data constitute a valid data point that could be used for subframe timing. So this intermediate point allows a new model to be fitted, and that is instead of just a straight line or a square wave, it includes a square wave with an intermediate point in the light curve during the transition that might be considered for subframe timing. And if the intermediate point doesn't meet AIC criteria, then integer frame timing is used. And that means that we just pick the point between frames as the time. Subframe timing is used when AIC indicates that the intermediate point is between the baseline and the event bottom, and this is referred to as within a subframe timing band. I'll show you that on the next slide. So here are two light curves. The one on the top has symmetrical noise. That means that the noise in the baseline and the event bottom are equal. But you notice that the baseline is separated far enough from the event bottom that we have a little green band within which, if there is a point that falls within that green band from either in the disappearance part of the transition or the reappearance part of the transition, R OTE can use that to improve the timing. So, for example, in the top light curve, the synthetic occultation had a disappearance at reading 200.5. And using the subframe timing method in R OTE, R OTE measured a disappearance of 200.37, plus or minus 0.35. We measured a result that is within the error bar of the actual result that was generated in a synthetic occultation. So in this example, we have improved the accuracy over reporting it as an occultation, say at either 200 or 201, which would be integer timing. The bottom light curve shows asymmetrical noise, and it allows us to increase the size of that subframe timing band. And in the bottom one, again, we use the same disappearance at 200.5 in the synthetic generated occultation. And because the noise variance or the band is wider, we even get a more precise result. We get a 200.57 measured by R OTE and a smaller error band, error bar. Next slide, please. Okay, so where there is no band, and that is, this is a symmetrical noise example where the event signal to noise ratio is so low that we can't separate the baseline from the event bottom. And in this case, the actual disappearance, again, is a synthetic light curve, 200.5, but R OTE will report an integer time of 200 plus or minus 1.5 plus 1.5 minus 0.5. So this gives you an example of what R OTE is now doing for subframe timing. Next slide, please. So currently, different occultation extraction programs deal with subframe timing in different ways. So, for example, Iota never uses subframe timing, only integer timing, and that's regardless of the signal to noise level. So for light curves with high signal to noise ratios, Iota will limit the precision of the occultation timing analysis. And the integer timing will be bracketed by error bars determined from Monte Carlo methods. Now this slide is cut off for me. I know what the other what it says, but I don't think our audience can see that. So the second bullet says that ocular always uses subframe timing, even when the signal to noise level is too low to warrant that implied precision. Recall that we wrote ocular several years ago, and we've learned a lot since then. But since the error bars in ocular are derived from Monte Carlo methods, those aren't affected by the subframe timing. They're still fairly accurate, we believe. And then the last bullet should show that R OTE provides subframe timing when the AIC criteria says that it's valid, and provides integer timing when AIC criteria says it's not valid, and that the error bars are representative of whether or not there is subframe timing or not, or if there's integer timing. Next slide. A couple of special features. Steve Preston requested that we have more user selectable confidence intervals in the error bars, and that's been implemented for gradual transitions. You can select 4 different error bar levels. It's still not available in R OTE for square waves, which is a little more complicated. And for square waves, we only use 90% error bars. And then another feature, which is new and experimental in a lot of respects, is Fourier filtering of 3 different types of light curve interference. You can have AC voltage interference. I'll show an example of that. You can have drift scan, microlensing, cyclical variation. I'll show an example of that. And then scintillation from atmospheric turbulence. And I'll show that one. Next slide. We can skip that one. Next slide, please. Okay. So this slide shows an example of AC voltage interference. And through the years, I received lots of light curves that I analyze for folks. And sometimes you actually see on the video a ripple line that cycles through the video. You see little AC ripples. And typically I'll contact the observer and say, looks like you have AC interference where you're using an AC to DC converter to power your camera. And typically they'll say yes. Now, the light curve, here's an example light curve at the top, looks kind of erratic, but the star brightness is remaining the same. The problem is that the ripple cycles through the video and affects the way iMovie and Tangra analyze the data. So we wanted to come up with a way to, number one, assess the interference, and then number two, maybe filter it out. So we're now using a Fourier filtering process, and the second graphic shows using a Fourier filter the ripple characteristics that we see in the data, and then the bottom graphic shows that when the filter is applied, we have pretty much a random noise type of light curve. So it allows us to perhaps filter out some of these AC voltage interferences, which might be helpful for low magnitude drop events or short duration events. Next slide. So in this slide, we're looking at the Fourier filtering of a micro-lensing cyclic variation. So the top graphic is it's real data. It was obtained by Gerhard Dangle by in the laboratory taking a test star of constant brightness and then recording that with a camera and then allowing the camera to move during the recording so that the star would drift across the camera chip. And you see a quite severe cyclic variation. Now, I've seen lots of real data and a lot with the PC164 EX2, the CEX2 cameras that mimic this in real life data. So I know that this is a real situation. And if we apply a Fourier filter to that data, which is shown in the middle slide where the red trace is the filter that it fits that data, and then we filter the data, we see that we can correct that out and get a fairly nice flat curve with random noise. We have yet to attempt to use this in a real occultation event, but at least now we have the capability to try to filter out some of this noise and maybe get a little better recording of the event DNR times as a result. Next slide. And this is coming across a little scratchy. You can refer to the original PowerPoint maybe if you want to see these a little better. The last example is Fourier filtering of scintillation noise. And this is an experimental feature. We're still trying to perfect this. But the top trace is one that I obtained this winter in Arizona of a star that was fairly low on the horizon. It's just the constant brightness of a star that's affected by atmospheric scintillation. Now, it turns out when we analyze this noise with a Fourier filter, it has a very characteristic appearance in the power spectrum, and this is documented in the literature as well, and that is the low frequency oscillations or variations are much higher in the power spectrum on the left side than the very high frequency variations. Random noise, or a simple, most of our observations high in the sky are Gaussian noise or random noise. The power spectrum will be very flat. Here it's very high on the left and very low on the right in the second graphic. So we're applying a correction to the power spectrum to flatten it as it would if it was just Gaussian noise, which you see in the third graphic. And then from that, we build a filter, which you see in the fourth graphic. And then if we apply the filter, we see that in the final graphic. So it's a powerful tool. We're not sure that it's entirely applicable yet, but that's how we move forward, is we try new things and see if they work. So again, well, actually, it has been tried. I just tried it on an event we got from Whitman College a few days ago, and it does appear to make a difference for low altitude target stars, where in the area of 15 to 25 degrees, the scintillation noise can have an effect. Next slide. So now we have R OTE 3.8.2. I've posted it on the Iota share folder Dropbox share folder, and I'm going to ask Brad if he'll also post it on his website. It's set up as a zip file package. So who should download this? Well, if you've been a past consistent user of Ocular or R OTE 3.3 or 3.1.1, not 3.1, then you're a good candidate to download 3.8.2. If you're an experienced observer that collects lots of data that was hard to extract low signal-to-noise ratio light curves, R OTE's going to be very helpful for you. Some of our software programmers who would like to think about implementing some of these new approaches could download it and play with it and see if these approaches make sense to them. Or any other Iota observers who just have good technical software skills, and you can follow detailed, complex instruction manuals, and you have lots of time and patience. R OTE 3.8.2 is a complex program and requires time and patience to master and operate. Next slide. Or is that our last slide? Okay. Future work. Okay. So R OTE 3.8.2, right now it's kind of the Swiss Army knife of occultation light curve analysis. We've put every blade and tool that we can think of in it, and maybe some aren't necessary. Maybe all you need is just a knife blade. For simple occultations, you don't need all these other tools. So ultimately, 3.8.2 may not really be what you need. So Bob Anderson is working on a Java program that it's going to look and feel more like Ocular, but it's going to implement many of the features of 3.8.2. It would have an improved GUI, would operate faster, and unlike some of our other programs like Ocular, which only work in Windows, Java can work across platforms. So look for something maybe at the next annual conference. We might have a new program in Java that he's going to call Jocular. Next slide. That may be our last slide. So I'm probably over my time. If there's any questions, I could answer those, or we can move on. Okay, I'm not.
Any questions in the room? Get it going.
We have a
Chad, you want the microphone?
No, I'm wondering if anybody else used road. I mean, I call it road. It says R OTE. R O. I just thought it was road.
all right. Anybody else? No questions? Okay, thank you, Tony.
Nice, just